There are three things the kingdom of Moonfang will remember for the rest of its history. 1. The Great Chicken Riot of year 412. 2. The time King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent accidentally declared a national holiday because he sneezed during a council meeting. 3. The evening Fiona Fluffernutter dragged her husband through the street by the ankle like a sack of extremely disappointing potatoes. This is that story. But before we begin, a warning. This story contains marital violence, deserved, public humiliation, very deserved, one male brothel, several chaotic noblewomen, and a king with the judgment of a caffeinated raccoon. So if you enjoy beautiful omegas snapping, terrible husbands getting what's coming to them, and royal chaos so dramatic historians will pretend it never happened, you should probably subscribe right now. Because if you don't, I will personally inform Madame Velvetina Wigglesworth, proprietor of Moonfang's most infamous establishment, that you volunteered to work the evening shift. And trust me, her customers are enthusiastic. Good. Now that we've established proper motivation, let us begin the disaster. Bartholomew Beefknuckle arrived home late, again. This was not unusual. Bartholomew had many hobbies. Unfortunately, most of them involved other people's wives. He pushed open the door of the small house he shared with Fiona Fluffernutter, already rehearsing his usual speech. He smelled like perfume, and cheap ale, and poor life choices. Fiona sat at the small wooden table in the center of the room, waiting, for the oil lamp flickered. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. Too calmly. Bartholomew sighed dramatically, removing his coat. "Before you start," he said, "I just want to say you're being very unreasonable lately." Fiona said nothing. He continued. "You know how lonely the women of this town can be." Still nothing. "I was simply helping someone emotionally." Fiona slowly lifted her eyes. Bartholomew kept talking. "Frankly, Fiona, your jealousy is becoming a problem in this marriage." Silence. Heavy silence. The kind of silence that makes smart men rethink their choices. Bartholomew Beefknuckle was not a smart man. "So if you could try to be more understanding." Fiona stood. Bartholomew blinked. Something about the way she stood was different. Calm. Controlled. Like a thunderstorm, politely putting on shoes. She walked toward him. Slowly. Bartholomew frowned. "Why are you walking like that?" Fiona stopped in front of him, tilted her head slightly, and said the calmest sentence she had spoken in 5 years of marriage. "Bartholomew." "Yes?" "Shut up." Then she slap-kicked him across the room. Bartholomew flew backward into a chair with a noise that could only be described as educational. The chair exploded. Bartholomew collapsed in a pile of splintered wood and regret. He stared up at Fiona in stunned disbelief. You can't just..." Fiona grabbed him by the collar. 5 years, she said pleasantly. Slap. "That was for the baker's daughter." Slap. "That was for the innkeeper's wife." Slap. "That was for the seamstress." Bartholomew raised a weak hand. "Technically, she seduced..." Fiona punched him directly into the floor. But neighbors later reported hearing sounds described as rhythmic, energetic, deeply therapeutic. Old Mrs. Bumbleton across the street even opened her window and shouted, "Get him again for last spring." Fiona happily obliged. 5 minutes later, the fight was over. Bartholomew lay on the floor, bruised, confused, reconsidering every decision he had ever made. Fiona calmly grabbed a rope from the kitchen. Bartholomew squinted. "Why do you have rope?" Fiona tied his wrists. Efficiently, expertly, like a woman who had been planning something for a very long time. "Fiona," he said nervously. "Yes, dear." "This feels illegal." She smiled. "Oh, don't worry." She dragged him toward the door. "I'm about to make it legal and profitable." Bartholomew blinked. What does that mean? Fiona opened the front door and began pulling him outside, but into the street, by the ankle. Bartholomew immediately started screaming. "Fiona, what are you doing?" "Taking out the trash." People began staring. Shopkeepers leaned out of windows. A baker paused mid-bread. 2 children followed the spectacle like it was a parade. Bartholomew bounced across the cobblestones. "Fiona, this isn't normal marriage behavior." "Oh, relax," she kept dragging him. "You like women so much." "Yes, wait, what?" Fiona smiled sweetly. "I'm simply taking you somewhere that will provide an endless supply of them." Bartholomew blinked. His brain slowly processed the direction they were walking. The music, the lights, the sign hanging above a very infamous building. His eyes widened in horror. "No." Fiona dragged him up the steps. "Fiona." She kicked open the doors. "Fiona, please." Inside, dozens of heads turned. Music stopped. Women stared. Men stared. And standing behind the velvet counter was the most dramatic woman in Moonfang, Madame Velvetina Wigglesworth. She adjusted her glasses, looked at Fiona, looked at Bartholomew tied up on the floor, then smiled slowly. "Well," she said, "this evening just became interesting." Fiona dragged her husband onto the center stage, dusting off her hands. "I would like to sell this husband." The room went silent. Bartholomew whispered weakly, "You can't sell husbands." Madame Wigglesworth rang a small golden bell. "Oh, sweetheart," she said cheerfully, "watch us." Madame Velvetina Wigglesworth's male brothel and emotional regret emporium had seen many things. Scandals, secret affairs, 3 separate dukes crying in the lobby, one man who tried to pay with a goat. But never, in all its glorious, a questionable history, had someone marched in and thrown her husband onto the auction stage like expired meat. Yet here they were. Bartholomew Beefknuckle lay sprawled on the polished wooden platform, wrists tied, hair messy, dignity completely missing. Fiona Fluffernutter stood over him like a victorious warrior who had just slain a dragon, or, in this case, a slightly sweaty butcher. The room stared. Music had stopped. Wine glasses hovered halfway to lips. Somewhere in the back, a woman whispered, "Is this part of the entertainment?" Madame Velvetina Wigglesworth slowly removed her glasses, polished them, put them back on. Then looked down at Bartholomew, then at Fiona, then back at Bartholomew. "Is he house-trained?" Fiona shrugged. "He knows how to sit." Bartholomew lifted his head weakly. "I do not." Fiona gently kicked him back down. The brothel patrons leaned forward with interest. Madame Wigglesworth folded her arms. "Darling," she said to Fiona, "people usually bring flowers when they visit." Fiona dusted her hands. "I brought a husband." Madame Wigglesworth considered this. "You're my favorite customer tonight." She clapped her hands sharply. "Ladies!" Instantly, the room erupted with movement. Curtains were pulled back. Chairs were dragged closer. Someone produced wine. Because if there was one thing Moonfang's upper-class women loved more than scandal, it was front-row seats to someone else's disaster. Bartholomew struggled against the ropes. "You can't sell me," he protested. Fiona leaned down. "Bartholomew." "Yes?" "You've been cheating on me for 5 years." "Allegedly." She tightened the knot. "You're being sold." Madame Wigglesworth rang a small golden bell. Ein Ding. "Oh, this is delicious," she said. "An unscheduled husband auction." The crowd began gathering, and with the gathering crowd came Moonfang's most terrifying force of nature. The Gossip Squad. Lady Butterbean arrived first, short, round, and carrying a fan she used mostly for dramatic emphasis. Right behind her swept Duchess Crumpetworth, tall and elegant with the posture of someone who had never done anything wrong in her life. which was impressive, considering she had done many things wrong. Then came Baroness Honeybiscuit, who had the cheerful smile of a woman who enjoyed chaos the way some people enjoyed cake. They pushed to the front row, stared at the stage, then stared at Fiona, then stared at Bartholomew, then leaned together and whispered, loudly. Lady Butterbean gasped. "Is that a husband?" Duchess Crumpetworth squinted. "Or he looks slightly used." Baroness Honeybiscuit tilted her head. "Does he come with emotional damage, or is that extra?" Bartholomew groaned. "I can hear you." Lady Butterbean nodded. "Yes, dear, that's the point." Madam Wigglesworth stepped onto the stage. "Well then." She turned dramatically toward the audience. "Ladies of Moonfang, welcome to tonight's surprise attraction." She gestured to Bartholomew. "A husband." A pause. Lightly battered. The room burst into laughter. Bartholomew tried to sit up. "I object." Madam Wigglesworth calmly picked up a decorative feather from the stage decorations and shoved it into his mouth. "Shh, dear." She patted his head. "Your inventory now." Bartholomew made muffled noises of outrage. Fiona crossed her arms proudly. Madam Wigglesworth lifted the golden bell again. "Now then," she announced, "let us begin." Ding! "Do I hear 10 silver for this emotionally unreliable gentleman?" A hand shot up immediately. 10, another voice. 12. 15. Lady Butterbean leaned forward excitedly. "Oh, this is better than opera." Duchess Crumpetworth nodded. "And less singing." Bartholomew's eyes widened in horror as the bids climbed. 20 silver, 30, 40. Someone shouted 50. He spat out the feather. "Fiona, please." "Quiet," she said calmly. "You're increasing your value." The crowd laughed. Madam Wigglesworth beamed. "This is the most competitive bidding we've had since Lord Pickleford got stuck in the chandelier." Baroness Honeybiscuit raised her hand. 60. Duchess Crumpetworth countered immediately. 70. Bartholomew looked around wildly. "Why are you people buying me?" Lady Butterbean answered cheerfully. "To our research." Madam Wigglesworth lifted the bell again. 70 silver going once." Then a voice spoke from the very back of the room. Deep, calm, commanding. 1,000. The room froze. Wine glasses stopped mid-air. Fans stopped fluttering. Even the piano player stopped breathing. Madam Wigglesworth blinked. Well, that escalated quickly. The crowd slowly turned towards the back of the room. A tall figure stepped forward. Powerful, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark cloak and a crown that gleamed in the candlelight. Fiona's eyes widened. Bartholomew whimpered. Because standing there was none other than King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent, and judging by the look on his face, he had just decided to buy a husband. The brothel went silent. Not the polite silence of people being respectful. No, and this was the did the king just walk into a husband auction kind of silence. Madame Velvetina Wigglesworth stood on stage, bell in hand, staring at the back of the room. 1,000. What? She said slowly. The crowd parted. Because when the Alpha King of Moonfang enters a brothel, people tend to move. Very quickly. Boots echoed against the polished floor. A tall figure stepped forward through the candlelight. Broad shoulders, dark cloak, golden crown catching the glow of 100 lanterns. The air shifted instantly. Every alpha in the room lowered their gaze. Every noblewoman sat up straighter. And Fiona Fluffernutter's brain stopped working for approximately 3 seconds. Because standing there was the last person she expected to see. King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent, ruler of Moonfang, terror of the battlefield, legendary alpha, former childhood menace. Magnus looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, confident, and wearing the exact same "This situation looks fun" expression he used to have when he suggested extremely bad ideas as a child. Fiona blinked. "Magnus?" Magnus blinked. "Fiona?" Bartholomew started crying. Not dramatically, not heroically, just soft, defeated whimpering. Because even he knew what it meant when the king bought you at a brothel auction. Madam Wigglesworth recovered first. "Your Majesty," she said brightly, "welcome to the Emotional Regret Emporium. We were not expecting royal attendance this evening." Magnus nodded politely. Clearly. His eyes flicked to the stage. Where Bartholomew Beefknuckle was tied up, bruised, and slowly realizing his life had taken a very strange turn. Then Magnus looked at Fiona again, and Fiona stared back. For a moment, neither of them spoke. 5 years of separation hung awkwardly in the air. Then Fiona crossed her arms. "You just offered 1,000 silver for my husband," Magnus nodded. "Yes." "Why?" Magnus shrugged casually. "Seemed like a good deal." Bartholomew made a choking noise. Madam Wigglesworth rang the bell again with obvious delight. "Well then," she grinned at the crowd. 1,000 silver from King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent." She raised the bell. "Do I hear a higher bid?" The room stayed silent. Because bidding against the king was a fantastic way to lose your property, your reputation, and possibly a limb. Madam Wigglesworth nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Ding. Sold." She gestured dramatically at Bartholomew. "To His Majesty." Bartholomew wheezed. I object." Madam Wigglesworth shoved the feather back in his mouth. "Shh." Magnus stepped closer to the stage. Behind him stood a tall, thin man with tired eyes and the posture of someone who had been dealing with Magnus's decisions for far too many years. This unfortunate individual was Sir Percival Puddingpants, the king's royal advisor. Sir Percival leaned toward Magnus and whispered urgently, "Your Majesty, please explain the plan before the historians get involved." Magnus folded his arms thoughtfully. "Oh, I have a plan." Sir Percival closed his eyes in relief. "Wonderful. What is it?" Magnus paused, then said very confidently, "I'll think of one on the way back." Sir Percival slowly opened his eyes again. "Your Majesty." "Yes?" "You just spent 1,000 silver on a married butcher." Magnus nodded. "Technically a former married butcher." Sir Percival pinched the bridge of his nose. "Why?" Magnus glanced at Fiona again. She was still standing there, still staring at him, still exactly as chaotic as he remembered. He smiled slightly. "Well," Magnus said casually, "Fiona looked like she was having a bad day." Sir Percival stared at him. "You bought a husband? To improve someone's mood?" Magnus shrugged. Seemed helpful. Meanwhile on the stage, Bartholomew spit out the feather again. "You can't just buy people." Magnus looked up at him calmly. "I just did." Bartholomew pointed frantically at Fiona. "She's my wife," Fiona waved. "Ex-wife, emotionally." Madam Wigglesworth clapped her hands happily. "Marvelous transaction, everyone." Magnus reached into his cloak and tossed a heavy pouch of coins onto the stage, where the bag hit the wood with a loud clang. 1,000 silver. Madam Wigglesworth caught it like a woman who loved money more than oxygen. She bowed dramatically. "A pleasure doing business with the crown." Magnus grabbed Bartholomew by the rope and yanked him off the stage. Bartholomew hit the floor with a yelp. Wait! Magnus started dragging him toward the door. Bartholomew flailed wildly. "Where are you taking me?" Magnus didn't even slow down. "To the palace." Bartholomew froze. "Why?" Magnus glanced back over his shoulder. His eyes flicked toward Fiona again. Then he grinned. "Oh," he said cheerfully. "I think the court ladies are going to love you." Sir Percival stared at the ceiling. Because at that exact moment he realized two terrible truths. The king absolutely did not have a plan. And somehow, things were about to get much worse. There are many ways to enter the royal palace of Moonfang. You can arrive as a noble guest. You can arrive as a respected diplomat. You can arrive as a heroic warrior returning from battle. Bartholomew Beefknuckle arrived face first on the marble floor, being dragged by the king. The palace guards watched this development with great interest, because in their many years of service they had seen political arguments, royal feasts, assassination attempts, and one very confusing goose. But they had never seen the king drag a tied-up butcher into the palace at midnight. King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent walked through the towering palace doors like this was completely normal. Behind him stumbled Bartholomew, bruised, dusty, emotionally destroyed, trailing rope. Sir Percival Puddingpants followed closely behind them with the expression of a man mentally drafting his resignation letter. Bartholomew attempted a final desperate protest. "Your Majesty, this is kidnapping." Magnus didn't slow down. "No, it isn't." "Yes, it is." Magnus glanced back. "I bought you." Bartholomew blinked. "That's worse." They marched into the grand council chamber, a massive hall with high stone pillars, long wooden tables, and the kind of intimidating atmosphere designed to make diplomats nervous. Tonight it was hosting something slightly different. A butcher. Magnus stopped in the center of the room and dropped the rope. Bartholomew collapsed onto the polished floor like a sack of deeply regrettable life choices. Sir Percival rubbed his temples. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "but please tell me you have reconsidered this purchase." Magnus sat casually at the council table. "I have not." Bartholomew raised a hand weakly. "I would like to return myself." "Denied." Sir Percival sighed. "Then perhaps you could explain the purpose of this situation." Magnus leaned back in his chair, thinking. The room waited. Bartholomew waited. Sir Percival waited. Finally, Magnus snapped his fingers. "I have it." Sir Percival immediately looked concerned. "What have you got?" Magnus stood, cleared his throat, and announced proudly, "Bartholomew Beefknuckle will serve the kingdom as romantic training equipment." The room went silent. Sir Percival blinked. "As what?" Magnus gestured toward the butcher. "For the unmarried ladies of the court." Bartholomew slowly sat up. I'm sorry." "What?" Magnus began pacing like a man explaining a brilliant invention. "The court is full of noblewomen who have never dealt with men like this." He pointed at Bartholomew. "Unfaithful, dishonest, dramatic." Bartholomew gasped. "I am standing right here," Magnus continued. "They require practical experience." Sir Percival stared at the ceiling. "Your Majesty?" "Yes?" "This is not how education works." Magnus waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense." Bartholomew pointed at the door. "I would like to leave." Magnus pointed at the rope. "You would like to sit down." Bartholomew sat down. Sir Percival looked like he might faint. "Your Majesty, the court ladies cannot simply share a butcher." Magnus tilted his head. "Why not?" Sir Percival opened his mouth, closed it, and then whispered, "I hate this job." At that exact moment, the chamber doors burst open. Two large men stomped inside wearing palace guard armor. They stopped, looked at Bartholomew tied on the floor, looked at Magnus, then at each other. The taller guard grinned. This was Captain Thud McKnuckles. Beside him stood his equally enthusiastic companion, Sergeant Bonk Ironhelm. Captain Thud scratched his beard. "Your Majesty?" "Yes, Captain." "Why is there a butcher tied up in the council chamber?" Magnus pointed proudly. "Training equipment." Sergeant Bonk nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." Sir Percival looked at him. "No, it does not." Captain Thud raised a hand eagerly. "Your Majesty, may we supervise the training?" Sergeant Bonk nodded. "For safety." Captain Thud grinned. and entertainment. Sir Percival stared at them in horror, but Magnus clapped his hands happily. Excellent initiative. Bartholomew lay on the floor, whispering, "This cannot be happening." Sir Percival leaned toward him. "Oh, it is." Meanwhile, across the city, a palace messenger knocked nervously on a small house door. Fiona Fluffernutter opened it. "Yes?" The messenger bowed. "His Majesty King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent requests your presence at the palace." Fiona narrowed her eyes. "Why?" The messenger hesitated, then said the worst possible sentence. "It concerns your husband." Fiona grabbed her coat immediately. 20 minutes later, the palace doors slammed open again. Fiona stormed into the council chamber like a hurricane wearing boots. Captain Thud stepped aside instantly. Sergeant Bonk moved even faster. Because when an angry Omega walks like that, you move. But Fiona marched straight into the chamber, stopped, looked around, saw the guards, saw Sir Percival, saw Bartholomew tied on the floor, and finally saw Magnus. Magnus brightened immediately. "Hello, Fiona." She pointed at Bartholomew. "You bought my husband." Magnus nodded. "Yes." Fiona stared. "Why?" Magnus folded his arms proudly. "For science." Sir Percival quietly sat down. Because at this point, there was absolutely nothing left to save. The Royal Council Chamber of Moonfang had hosted many historic events, war declarations, peace treaties, one extremely tense argument about cheese tariffs. It had never hosted an angry Omega, a tied-up butcher, 2 guards trying not to laugh, and a king defending something called the Royal Boy Toy Program. Yet here they all were, for Fiona Fluffernutter stood in the middle of the room, with her arms crossed so tightly they might qualify as weapons. Bartholomew Beefknuckle was still on the floor, tied up, emotionally exhausted, reconsidering every flirtatious wink he had ever performed in his life. King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent stood across from Fiona with the relaxed posture of a man who had absolutely no survival instincts. Sir Percival Puddingpants stood nearby, looking like someone had asked him to professionally manage a circus. Fiona pointed at Bartholomew. "So let me understand this." Magnus nodded politely. "Of course. You bought my husband." "Yes." "You brought him to the palace." "Yes." "You tied him up." Magnus paused. "That part was actually you." Fiona ignored him. "And now," she said slowly, "you plan to let noblewomen practice romance on him." Magnus clasped his hands. "That is the current strategy." Bartholomew raised a weak hand. "I would like to resign from this strategy." No one acknowledged him. Fiona stared at Magnus. Magnus stared back. For a moment the room felt oddly familiar, like something from years ago. Then Fiona sighed. "You're still like this." Magnus smiled slightly. "Like what?" "Ridiculous." Sir Percival leaned closer to Magnus and whispered quietly, "This is a terrible idea." Magnus whispered back just as quietly, "I know." Sir Percival closed his eyes. "Why are we doing it then?" Magnus glanced at Fiona. "Because it's working." Sir Percival followed his gaze. Fiona had stopped glaring. Instead, she was looking around the chamber with the strange expression of someone remembering something. Magnus noticed. "But do you remember this room?" Fiona snorted. "You mean the room where you almost started a civil war with a goat?" Captain Thud McKnuckles coughed loudly to hide his laughter. Sergeant Bonk Ironhelm failed completely. Magnus raised a finger defensively. "That goat was extremely fast. You tried to ride it into battle. It looked heroic at the time." Sir Percival muttered, "It did not." Fiona shook her head. "You haven't changed." Magnus grinned. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Oh, really?" "Really?" Fiona stepped closer. "Do you remember the Great Chicken Riot?" Captain Thud perked up. Oh, I heard about that one. Magnus groaned. That was not my fault. Fiona laughed. You released 30 chickens into the marketplace because you said they deserved freedom. Magnus defended himself, or they were emotionally oppressed. They chased the baker into a fountain. That was unexpected. Sir Percival rubbed his face. I cannot believe this man runs a kingdom. Fiona folded her arms again. And what about the honey cake robbery? Magnus brightened. That was a success. You stole 12 honey cakes from the royal kitchen. We were hungry. You blamed the palace cat. The cat had motive. Fiona shook her head slowly. Then she said the worst possible memory. And the goat. Captain Thud leaned forward eagerly. Magnus groaned again. That was one time. Fiona looked at the guards. He put a helmet on a goat. Sergeant Bonk wheezed. Magnus protested. It was a strong goat. You declared it your battle steed. Sir Percival whispered, I'm learning things about my king that disturb me. Fiona finished calmly. Or the goat ran away. Magnus sighed. Traitorous animal. For the first time since entering the palace, Fiona laughed, a real laugh, bright, uncontrolled. Magnus watched her carefully, because he remembered that laugh, and he had not heard it in 5 years. Meanwhile, across the palace, Bartholomew Beefknuckle was being dragged down a very long hallway. Captain Thud held one arm, Sergeant Bonk held the other. Bartholomew struggled weakly. Where are you taking me? Captain Thud grinned. To meet the court ladies. Bartholomew paled. I don't want to meet the court ladies. Sergeant Bonk opened a large double door. Oh, you definitely do. Inside sat 4 elegant noblewomen around a tea table. They turned slowly as the guards entered. Bartholomew immediately realized something terrible, but they were looking at him like a group of cats spotting a confused mouse. Captain Thud cleared his throat. Ladies, he gestured proudly, your training equipment. The women stood, graceful, elegant, and terrifying. First came Lady Peaches Gigglebottom, smiling sweetly. Next, Lady Marzipan Flutterkiss, studying him like a curious scientist. Then Lady Poppy Snugglepuff, who waved excitedly. And finally Lady Dandelion Twinkletoe, who tilted her head thoughtfully. Bartholomew whispered, I would like to go home. Lady Peaches giggled. Oh, darling. Lady Marzipan circled him slowly. You are home. Lady Poppy clapped her hands happily. This will be fun. Lady Dandelion smiled gently. We have so many questions. Bartholomew looked at the guards in horror. Captain Thud nodded reassuringly. Torch, don't worry. Sergeant Bonk added, This is punishment. The doors closed behind them, and somewhere in the palace, Bartholomew Beefknuckle finally understood something important. Fiona Fluffernutter had not ruined his life. She had simply handed it to professionals. News in the kingdom of Moonfang traveled very fast, not because of official messengers, not because of royal announcements, but because of old women with excellent hearing and absolutely no hobbies. By sunrise the next morning, the entire kingdom knew 3 very important facts. An Omega had sold her husband at a brothel. The king had bought him. And the palace had apparently started something called a romantic training program. Historians would later refer to this moment as the day the Gossip Network achieved full operational capacity. It started in the marketplace. A baker leaned over the counter and whispered to a customer. Did you hear? Hear what? An Omega sold her husband last night. The customer gasped. To who? The baker leaned closer. The king. The customer dropped her bread. Across the street, the butcher heard the story and shouted, The king bought a husband? Within 10 minutes, the entire marketplace was discussing the situation with the seriousness of a political crisis. Why would the king buy a husband? Research. For what? Marriage mistakes. That's actually quite responsible. At the same time, inside the royal palace, Sir Percival Puddingpants stood in the council chamber holding a stack of messages. He looked tired, more tired than usual, which was impressive. Magnus sat at the long council table casually eating breakfast, but Fiona sat across from him with a cup of tea and the expression of someone enjoying the unfolding chaos. Sir Percival cleared his throat. "Your Majesty." "Yes, Percival." "The rumors have begun." Magnus took a bite of toast. "Already?" Sir Percival opened the first letter. "The Eastern District believes the palace has opened a romantic academy." Magnus nodded thoughtfully. "That's not entirely inaccurate." Sir Percival opened another. "The Northern District believes the king is personally testing husbands for quality control." Fiona snorted into her tea. Sir Percival opened a third. "And the Western District believes the butcher is being punished for crimes against women." Magnus shrugged. "Also accurate." Sir Percival dropped the letters onto the table. "Whereas the kingdom thinks you are running a husband correction facility." Magnus leaned back in his chair proudly. "That sounds organized." Sir Percival stared at him. "You accidentally started a social reform movement." Fiona laughed again. Meanwhile, across the city, inside a large house filled with expensive furniture and deeply unpleasant energy, Lady Petunia Picklebottom was enjoying her morning tea. Lady Petunia Picklebottom was a woman of great elegance, great pride, and absolutely zero moral flexibility. She sat at the breakfast table examining her nails when her maid rushed into the room. "Milady," Petunia frowned. "What is it?" The maid gasped dramatically. "There has been a scandal." Petunia perked up slightly. She loved scandals. "As long as it isn't about this family." The maid hesitated. "It is about this family." Petunia froze. "What?" The maid whispered the worst sentence possible. "Your stepdaughter sold her husband at a brothel." Petunia dropped her teacup. It shattered on the floor. "She did what?" The maid continued. "And the king bought him." Petunia clutched the table. "The king bought the butcher?" The maid nodded. "And now the palace is using him for training." Petunia blinked rapidly. Her brain tried to process the situation. It failed, completely. She stood up, sat down, stood up again, then promptly fainted into a fruit basket. Several apples rolled dramatically across the floor. 5 minutes later, Petunia sat upright again, hair messy, dignity slightly bruised. "This cannot be happening," the maid nodded. "Oh, it is." Petunia grabbed her coat. "I must go to the palace immediately." "Why?" Petunia straightened proudly. "For to support my dear stepdaughter, of course." The maid blinked slowly. "You sold her to a butcher 5 years ago." Petunia sniffed. That was financial planning. Meanwhile, at the royal palace, the massive kitchen was alive with morning activity. Cooks chopped vegetables, servants carried trays, and standing in the middle of the chaos was the most powerful individual in the entire palace. The palace cook, a terrifying woman named Madame Griddleboom. Madame Griddleboom ran the royal kitchen with the discipline of a military commander and the emotional warmth of a thunderstorm. Fiona stood at the counter, eating a honey cake. Magnus leaned against the wall nearby. Sir Percival sat at the table, reviewing paperwork. Madame Griddleboom slammed a pan onto the stove. "So," she looked at Magnus, "you bought a husband?" Magnus nodded. "Yes." Madame Griddleboom pointed a spoon at him. "Why?" Magnus opened his mouth, paused, then pointed at Fiona. "Her idea." Fiona almost choked on the honey cake. "Liar." Madame Griddleboom looked at Fiona. "You sold him?" "Yes." Madame Griddleboom nodded thoughtfully. "Good." Magnus blinked. "You approve?" Madame Griddleboom shrugged. "Men like that ruin good marriages." Sir Percival raised a hand. This was not technically a marriage improvement strategy. Madame Griddleboom glared at him. Did she improve her marriage? Yes. Then it worked. At that exact moment, the palace doors slammed open. A dramatic voice echoed through the hall. Fiona, my dear child. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway was a woman wearing far too much perfume and a painfully fake smile. Lady Petunia Picklebottom. She spread her arms dramatically. Oh, Fiona! Fiona stared. Magnus stared. Sir Percival stared. Madame Griddleboom slowly picked up a rolling pin. Petunia rushed forward. My beloved stepdaughter, I came the moment I heard the terrible rumors. Fiona raised an eyebrow. You mean the rumors where I solved my marriage? Petunia laughed nervously. Oh, darling, I always knew you were strong, Magnus whispered to Sir Percival. Do we believe her? Sir Percival whispered back. Not even slightly. Madame Griddleboom leaned toward Fiona. Want me to throw her out? Fiona considered it. Petunia grabbed Fiona's hands dramatically. I am here to support you. Fiona tilted her head. You sold me to a butcher. Petunia coughed. That was a misunderstanding. Magnus stepped forward slowly, smiling pleasantly, which was always a dangerous sign. Lady Picklebottom. Petunia bowed. Word, Your Majesty. Magnus gestured casually toward the door. You should probably leave. Petunia blinked. But I came to help. Magnus shrugged. No one believes you. Madame Griddleboom raised the rolling pin. Not even the cook. Petunia looked around the room. Every face was staring at her, unimpressed, judging, possibly hungry. She cleared her throat. I will come back later. She fled. The palace doors slammed shut behind her. Madame Griddleboom nodded approvingly. Good decision. Sir Percival sighed deeply. Your Majesty. Yes, Percival. The kingdom believes you are running a husband correction program. Magnus smiled. Well. He glanced toward the wing of the palace where Bartholomew was currently being questioned by 4 curious noblewomen. If that rumor spreads, Sir Percival groaned. Gord, please do not expand the program. Magnus thought about it. Fiona saw the look on his face. Oh no. Magnus grinned. Oh yes. There are many things a man can survive in life. War, hard labor, embarrassing childhood stories. Bartholomew Beefknuckle was currently discovering that there was one thing far more terrifying than all of them combined. 4 noblewomen with free time and a curriculum. Because somewhere between sunrise and mid-morning, the Royal Boy Toy program had become organized. No one knew exactly how. Not Magnus, not Sir Percival, not even the guards. But the moment the court ladies realized they had access to a terrible husband for educational purposes, they had formed a committee. And committees were dangerous. Very dangerous. Bartholomew sat in a chair in a large palace sitting room. His wrists were no longer tied, but which should have been reassuring. Unfortunately, the doors were guarded by Captain Thud McKnuckles and Sergeant Bonk Ironhelm, both of whom were watching with the eager enthusiasm of men attending the world's most entertaining play. Bartholomew looked at them desperately. Please let me leave. Captain Thud shook his head. Orders. Sergeant Bonk added helpfully. Also, we want to see what happens next. Across the room, 4 noblewomen sat at a long table covered in notebooks. Yes, notebooks. Lady Peaches Gigglebottom adjusted her spectacles. Lady Marzipan Flutterkiss tapped a pencil thoughtfully. Lady Poppy Snugglepuff bounced excitedly in her seat. Lady Dandelion Twinkletoe looked at Bartholomew the way scholars examine rare insects. Bartholomew swallowed. I feel like this is illegal. Lady Peaches smiled kindly. Oh no, dear. Lady Marzipan flipped open her notebook. This is educational. Lady Poppy clapped her hands. Let's begin. Bartholomew closed his eyes. Please don't. Lady Peaches stood and approached him. Lesson 1. she said calmly. Basic etiquette. Bartholomew blinked. What? Lady Peaches folded her hands politely. When you return home late smelling like another woman's perfume. She leaned forward slightly. What is the correct thing to say to your wife? Bartholomew hesitated. Nothing? Lady Marzipan wrote something down. Incorrect. Lady Dandelion spoke gently. You apologize. Bartholomew stared. For what? All four women stared back. Bartholomew shifted nervously. Hypothetically. Lady Poppy raised her hand. Should we hit him? Captain Thud perked up. Can we help? Sergeant Bonk nodded enthusiastically. Lord Bartholomew panicked. I apologize, Lady Marzipan wrote another note. Progress. Meanwhile, across the palace, Fiona Fluffernutter was laughing, not politely, not quietly, violently. She leaned against the balcony railing, trying to breathe. Magnus stood beside her, watching with great interest. Inside the sitting room below them, the court ladies continued their work. Lady Peaches now held a small bell. Ding! Lesson 2, she announced. Flirting practice. Bartholomew looked terrified. Lady Poppy sat in the chair across from him. Pretend I am your wife. Bartholomew leaned forward awkwardly. Hello? Lady Poppy smiled sweetly. Yes? Bartholomew thought very hard. Nice weather. Lady Marzipan sighed. Lady Dandelion rubbed her temples. Lady Peaches rang the bell again. Hopeless. On the balcony, Fiona wheezed with laughter. I can't believe this is happening. Magnus leaned on the railing beside her. It's going quite well. Fiona pointed towards the room below. They're psychologically dismantling him. Magnus nodded thoughtfully. Very educational. Fiona wiped tears from her eyes. You really started this. Magnus shrugged. You sold him first. That was justice. This is research. Fiona laughed again, bright, loud, uncontrolled. Magnus watched her and realized something extremely inconvenient. He liked that laugh. A lot. Actually. He had always liked it. He had just forgotten. Fiona caught him staring. What? Magnus blinked. Nothing. She narrowed her eyes. You're smiling. Magnus looked away casually. I do that sometimes. Not usually at me. Magnus cleared his throat. Well? He glanced toward the chaos below. Toward you do create excellent entertainment. Fiona rolled her eyes, but she was still smiling. Meanwhile, downstairs, Lady Dandelion had begun Lesson 3. She stood in front of Bartholomew, holding a notebook. Today we discuss emotional accountability. Bartholomew looked deeply unhappy. I hate those words. Lady Marzipan leaned forward. When you cheat on someone. Bartholomew raised a finger. Allegedly. Lady Peaches rang the bell. Ding. Penalty. Captain Thud cracked his knuckles happily. Sergeant Bonk stretched his arms. Bartholomew panicked. When you cheat on someone, Lady Dandelion nodded. Yes? You should apologize. Lady Marzipan wrote another note. Remarkable. Lady Poppy beamed. What he's learning, Bartholomew whispered to himself. I should have stayed at the brothel. Meanwhile, in another room of the palace, Sir Percival Puddingpants sat alone at a desk. A quill rested in his hand. In front of him was a very official piece of paper. He sighed deeply, then began writing. Dear Royal Council, I regret to inform you that I am resigning from my position as advisor to King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent. He paused. From somewhere down the hallway came the sound of Lady Poppy shouting, No, Bartholomew, you must use your words. Sir Percival continued writing. The palace has recently begun a husband rehabilitation program. He paused again. Captain Thud shouted, Hit him with the pillow. Sir Percival closed his eyes, then added one final sentence. I cannot legally explain the situation. He signed the letter, folded it, and whispered quietly to himself, I should have become a baker. By the evening of the third day, the kingdom of Moonfang had reached a historic moment. Not a war, not a treaty, not a royal wedding. No. The entire noble class had gathered at the palace to witness something far more important. The consequences of Bartholomew Beefknuckles' life choices. The royal banquet hall glittered with candlelight. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Long tables overflowed with roasted meats, fruit, wine, pastries, and enough desserts to cause national concern. Normally, these grand banquets celebrated diplomatic victories or political alliances. Tonight, they celebrated gossip. Every noble in Moonfang had arrived early, because no one wanted to miss the evening's main attraction, the Royal Boy Toy Program. At the far end of the hall, the two very familiar women sat in the front row of the unfolding spectacle. Lady Butterbean fanned herself dramatically. Beside her, Duchess Crumpetworth sipped wine with the calm focus of a professional observer. Between them sat Baroness Honeybiscuit with a notebook. Lady Butterbean leaned forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," she whispered loudly, "welcome to tonight's entertainment." Duchess Crumpetworth nodded. "The butcher appears nervous." Baroness Honeybiscuit scribbled something down. "His posture suggests regret." Across the hall, Bartholomew Beefknuckle stood in borrowed noble clothing. The clothing was very nice. Unfortunately, it did not fix his face, or his situation. He looked around the banquet hall with the expression of a man who had accidentally wandered into a lion enclosure wearing meat. Dozens of noblewomen were watching him, smiling, taking notes. Lady Peach's Gigglebottom waved cheerfully from one table. Lady Poppy Snugglepuff gave him a thumbs up. Lady Marzipan Flutterkiss was writing something very detailed in her notebook. Lady Dandelion Twinkletoe simply smiled, the calm smile of a woman who had spent 2 days explaining emotional responsibility to a brick wall. Bartholomew whispered to himself, "I am going to die here." Meanwhile, near the royal table, Fiona Fluffernutter stood beside a column watching the chaos unfold. Magnus stood next to her holding a glass of wine and looking extremely pleased with himself. Fiona shook her head slowly. "You turned my terrible marriage into a public festival." Magnus shrugged. "The people needed morale." Fiona snorted. "Morale?" Magnus gestured toward the crowd. But every noble in the hall was staring at Bartholomew like he was an exotic zoo animal. "Well," Magnus said, "they seem happy." Fiona watched Bartholomew attempt a nervous bow to Lady Peaches. It went badly. He knocked over a chair. Lady Butterbean clapped enthusiastically. "Excellent form," Fiona laughed. Magnus glanced sideways at her. There it was again. That laugh. The same one she had when they were children, before life had gotten complicated, before 5 years of bad marriage, before everything. Magnus cleared his throat. "You know," Fiona raised an eyebrow. "What?" "You used to laugh like that when we caused trouble." Fiona looked at him suspiciously. "We caused trouble constantly." Magnus nodded proudly. "We were very productive." She smirked. "You once tried to start a rebellion against the palace bedtime rule." Magnus pointed defensively. "That rule was oppressive. You convinced half the servants to join you. They deserved freedom. You fell asleep during the rebellion. It was a tactical nap." Fiona rolled her eyes. "You haven't grown up at all." Magnus leaned closer. "Neither of you." Fiona blinked slightly. Magnus's voice had softened. The noise of the banquet faded for a moment. Then, crash. Both of them turned. Across the hall, Bartholomew Beefknuckle had made a decision. A terrible decision. A desperate decision. He was running. Bartholomew sprinted toward the banquet hall doors with the determination of a man who had reached his psychological limit. Lady Butterbean gasped. "Oh!" Duchess Crumpetworth leaned forward eagerly. "Your escape attempt!" Baroness Honeybiscuit began writing faster. Time of incident, immediately after pudding. Bartholomew burst toward the exit and ran directly into Captain Thud McNuckles. Thud didn't even move. Bartholomew bounced off him like a thrown loaf of bread. The guard looked down calmly. "Going somewhere," Bartholomew wheezed. "I need fresh air." Sergeant Bonk Ironhelm appeared beside him instantly. "You had fresh air yesterday." Captain Thud grabbed the back of Bartholomew's collar. The hall erupted in laughter. Lady Butterbean fanned herself. "Magnificent capture." Duchess Crumpetworth nodded approvingly. "Excellent defensive positioning." Captain Thud dragged Bartholomew back toward the center of the hall. Sergeant Bonk waved cheerfully at the crowd. "False alarm, everyone." Bartholomew whispered, "I hate this kingdom." Meanwhile, at the royal table, Fiona was laughing so hard she had to hold the table for support. Magnus watched her again, and once again he noticed something dangerous. He liked making her laugh. Actually, he liked being near her, which was a problem, because Fiona noticed him staring again. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Magnus blinked. "Like what?" "Like you're planning something." Magnus smiled slightly. "I'm always planning something." Fiona crossed her arms. "That is deeply concerning." Magnus leaned closer. "You sold your husband at a brothel. That was justice. And now you're living in the palace. Temporary." Magnus tilted his head. "We'll see." Fiona opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. All because Magnus was smiling at her the way he used to when they were kids. Like they were about to do something reckless, something stupid, something fun. And suddenly Fiona realized something equally dangerous. She missed that feeling. Across the room, Sir Percival Puddingpants was watching the entire interaction. He slowly lowered his wine glass, then sighed deeply. Oh no. Captain Thud dragged Bartholomew back to his chair. The court ladies resumed their note-taking. The gossip squad whispered excitedly, and Sir Percival leaned back in his chair with the exhausted wisdom of a man who could see the future. Because he knew two things for certain. First, the Royal Boy Toy program had officially become the most popular event in the kingdom. And second, if Magnus Fluffington kept looking at Fiona Fluffernutter like that, the next royal scandal would be much bigger. By the next morning, the Palace of Moonfang was exhausted. The royal banquet disaster had lasted until midnight. Several nobles had to be carried home. Lady Butterbean had lost her voice from commentary. Duchess Crumpetworth had written 37 pages of observations. Baroness Honeybiscuit had started drafting what she called the official historical record of Bartholomew's poor decisions. And somewhere in the palace courtyard, Bartholomew Beefknuckle sat on a bench, staring into the distance, like a man whose soul had quietly packed its bags and moved to another country. Unfortunately for him, the day was about to get worse. Because inside the palace throne room, King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent had just had an idea, which was always dangerous. Very dangerous. The royal court had gathered that morning. Nobles filled the room. The gossip squad sat proudly in the front row. Lady Butterbean had brought a cushion. Duchess Crumpetworth held a fresh notebook. Baroness Honeybiscuit had 3 quills ready, because whenever King Magnus called a court meeting these days, something ridiculous usually happened. Magnus sat comfortably on his throne. Fiona Fluffernutter stood nearby with her arms crossed. Sir Percival Puddingpants stood beside the throne, looking like a man who had slept approximately 3 minutes. Magnus cleared his throat. My loyal subjects. The room quieted. Sir Percival braced himself. Magnus smiled. I have made an important decision. Sir Percival whispered immediately. Oh no, Magnus continued proudly. After observing recent events, Lady Butterbean leaned forward eagerly. And evaluating the impressive results of the Royal Boy Toy program, Duchess Crumpetworth began writing. I have decided to create a new royal position. Sir Percival slowly turned his head. What? Magnus gestured toward Fiona. Fiona Fluffernutter will remain in the palace as royal advisor on terrible husband management. The throne room went silent, then exploded. Nobles began whispering. Lady Butterbean gasped. Duchess Crumpetworth slammed her notebook shut. Historic, Baroness Honeybiscuit wrote rapidly. New government department created. Sir Percival stared at Magnus. That is not a real job. Magnus nodded calmly. It is now. Sir Percival rubbed his temples. You cannot create government positions based on personal chaos. Magnus looked confused. Why not? Sir Percival opened his mouth, closed it, then sighed deeply. I need a vacation. Meanwhile, Fiona stared at Magnus. You're joking. Magnus looked innocent. Do I look like I'm joking? Yes. That's fair. Fiona stepped closer. You can't just keep me in the palace because you think this is funny. Magnus leaned slightly toward her. I think it's effective. Fiona pointed toward the courtyard window. My husband is currently being psychologically dismantled by 4 noblewomen. Magnus nodded. Yes. That is not government policy. Magnus considered that. It could be. Sir Percival whispered weakly, I beg you to stop talking. Across the courtyard, Bartholomew Beefknuckle was also having a moment, because after 3 days of humiliation, 3 days of lectures, 3 days of watching nobles laugh at him, Bartholomew had reached a conclusion. He had to reclaim control of his life. He stood up slowly. Captain Thud McKnuckles and Sergeant Bonk Ironhelm watched him curiously. Bartholomew took a deep breath, then marched toward the palace doors with the determination of a man about to deliver a very important speech. Captain Thud leaned toward Sergeant Bonk. Should we stop him? Sergeant Bonk shrugged. Let's see what happens. Bartholomew burst into the throne room dramatically. The entire court turned to stare. Bartholomew raised his hands. I demand my freedom. Silence filled the room, as Magnus blinked. Fiona sighed. Sir Percival whispered, This should be educational. Bartholomew pointed dramatically at Fiona. You sold me. Fiona nodded. Yes. Bartholomew pointed at Magnus. You bought me. Magnus nodded. Yes. Bartholomew spread his arms. This is illegal. Captain Thud stepped forward. No, it isn't. Bartholomew pointed wildly around the room. I refuse to participate in this madness. Lady Poppy Snugglepuff raised her hand politely. But we haven't finished Lesson 4. Bartholomew froze. Lesson 4. Lady Marzipan Flutterkiss checked her notebook. Conflict resolution? Lady Dandelion Twinkletoe smiled gently. You were doing very well yesterday. Bartholomew slowly turned back toward the door. Captain Thud cracked his knuckles. Sergeant Bonk blocked the exit. Bartholomew looked around the throne room. But the nobles were watching eagerly. The court ladies were smiling. The guards were ready. Fiona looked unimpressed. Magnus looked entertained. Sir Percival had begun quietly eating grapes. Bartholomew lowered his arms. I hate all of you. Lady Peaches rang her bell. Ding! Excellent emotional honesty. Bartholomew collapsed into a chair, and for the first time in his life, he realized something truly terrifying. The entire kingdom had united around a single shared goal, fixing him. And no one, absolutely no one, was on his side. By the end of the week, the kingdom of Moonfang had achieved something historians would later describe as an administrative miracle fueled entirely by gossip and poor life decisions. Inside the palace courtyard, a small ceremony was taking place. Not a wedding, not a coronation. No, this was far more unusual, for Bartholomew Beefknuckle stood in the center of the courtyard wearing a sash that read, Royal Training Assistant. He stared at it. then stared at the crowd, then stared into the distance like a man questioning every decision he had ever made since birth. Sir Percival Puddingpants stepped forward holding a scroll. He cleared his throat. "By decree of His Majesty, King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent," Bartholomew whispered weakly. "Please don't." Sir Percival continued. "Bartholomew Beefknuckle is hereby assigned to permanent court lady training duty." The court ladies erupted into cheers. Lady Peaches Gigglebottom clapped politely. Lady Marzipan Flutterkiss adjusted her notebook proudly. Lady Poppy Snugglepuff jumped with excitement. Lady Dandelion Twinkletoe smiled with calm, scholarly satisfaction. Lady Poppy hugged him immediately. "Gord, you're part of the curriculum now." Bartholomew stared into the sky. "I miss the brothel." Across the courtyard, the gossip squad observed the moment with intense professional focus. Lady Butterbean wiped a tear from her eye. "Justice." Duchess Crumpetworth nodded solemnly. "Educational justice." Baroness Honeybiscuit wrote dramatically, and thus the kingdom weaponized personal accountability. Meanwhile, inside the palace entrance hall, Madame Velvetina Wigglesworth had arrived. She swept into the room in dramatic purple velvet, feathers bouncing enthusiastically from her hat. Magnus looked up from his throne. "Madame Wigglesworth." She bowed gracefully. "Your Majesty." Magnus leaned forward. "What brings you here today?" Madame Wigglesworth smiled like a woman with a business opportunity. "Well, Your Majesty, since your palace has effectively turned my former customer into a public training exhibit." Magnus nodded slowly. "That did happen." She clasped her hands together. "I was wondering if the Crown might provide a royal endorsement for my establishment." Sir Percival nearly dropped his documents. "You want the palace to endorse a brothel," Madame Wigglesworth corrected gently. "An emotional regret emporium." Magnus considered this carefully. Sir Percival stared at him in horror. "Your Majesty, do not—" Magnus nodded. "That seems reasonable." Sir Percival whispered weakly, "I need stronger wine." Across the palace grounds, another issue had also been resolved. Lady Petunia Picklebottom stood outside the palace gates arguing with two guards. "I demand to see my stepdaughter." Captain Thud McKnuckles crossed his arms. "No." Sergeant Bonk Ironhelm nodded firmly. "Royal order." Lady Petunia gasped dramatically. "You cannot ban me." Captain Thud held up a parchment. "It says here, Lady Petunia Picklebottom is permanently banned from the palace for suspicious mothering and excessive nonsense." Sergeant Bonk added helpfully, "There's also a drawing." Lady Petunia squinted. "Is that supposed to be me?" Captain Thud nodded. "It's very accurate." The gates slammed shut. Lady Petunia shrieked. Inside the palace, peace had finally returned. Mostly. Fiona Fluffernutter stood on the balcony overlooking the courtyard. The sun was setting. Below her, the court ladies were already beginning another training session. Bartholomew was trying to hide behind a fountain. It was not working. Fiona chuckled softly. Magnus stepped onto the balcony beside her. For a moment, they both just watched the chaos below. Finally, Fiona spoke. "You turned my life into a circus." Magnus nodded proudly. "A successful circus." She looked at him. "You really didn't have a plan when you bought him, did you?" Magnus smiled. "Absolutely not." Fiona laughed again. That laugh. The same one from when they were children. Magnus leaned against the balcony railing. "You know," Fiona glanced at him. "What?" "You were always the brave one." She raised an eyebrow. "I was the one dragging you out of trouble?" Magnus shrugged. "That too." Fiona looked back out at the courtyard, at the palace, at the life she never expected to have. Then she sighed softly. "You never really stopped looking out for me, did you?" Magnus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smiled that same mischievous smile he had as a boy. And then he said casually, "By the way, Fiona." "Yes? If you ever want to sell another husband?" Fiona slowly turned toward him. Magnus grinned. "I'll give you a discount." Fiona stared at him. Then she laughed. A real laugh. The kind that echoed across the palace walls, and somewhere below them. Bartholomew Beefknuckle tripped over a chair while attempting Lesson 5. Honest communication. The court ladies took notes, the guards laughed, the gossip squad prepared new commentary, and thus the kingdom of Moonfang entered a brand new era, one ruled by the chaotic brilliance of King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent, and the only woman in the kingdom brave enough to solve her marriage problems by auctioning her husband. And that, dear listeners, was how the kingdom of Moonfang accidentally invented the most chaotic relationship counseling program in history. Bartholomew Beefknuckle is still alive, mostly because the court ladies need him for advanced training modules like How Not to Gaslight Your Wife, Apologizing Without Sweating, and the very difficult masterclass, Stop Making Everything Worse. The Royal Boy Toy program is now fully funded by the Crown. Sir Percival Puddingpants has stopped trying to resign and instead started writing a very long book titled How Did My Career Become This? Madame Velvetina Wigglesworth now proudly hangs a royal seal outside her establishment that reads, Official Supplier of Bad Decisions to the Crown. Lady Petunia Picklebottom is still banned from the palace and is currently arguing with pigeons outside the gate about inheritance rights. And as for Fiona Fluffernutter and King Magnus Fluffington the Magnificent, well, let's just say the palace servants have noticed a few suspicious developments. Fiona laughs a lot more these days. The king keeps finding excuses to keep her around, and every time they argue, they somehow end up laughing like they did when they were children, which, in this kingdom, is usually how dangerous things begin. But that is chaos for another day. Now, before you wander off like Bartholomew attempting another escape plan, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because if you don't, Sir Percival Puddingpants will be forced to personally explain the entire Royal Boy Toy program to you in a 6-hour lecture with diagrams. And trust me, nobody wants that. So subscribe, like the video, and come back for the next ridiculous story, where someone else in Moonfang will inevitably make a terrible life decision, and the entire kingdom will gather snacks to watch the consequences. Good night. And remember, if your partner keeps cheating, you could try communication, or therapy, or, the brothel auction option.